On today's show, Bert welcomes cannabis leader Jamie Shaw. Noted as Canada's only court-certified dispensary expert, Shaw was a key witness in the Allard trial, which came before the federal court and gave medical patients the right to grow cannabis themselves. She has successfully lobbied for dispensary regulation in Vancouver, Victoria, and other Canadian municipalities under prohibition, and has consulted at length with all levels of government on cannabis regulations. As the director of the BC Independent Cannabis Association and partner at Groundwork Consulting, Shaw continues advocating for and working with the growing Canadian cannabis industry. We go now to Bert in conversation.
Good afternoon. Welcome to Friday. My special guest today is Jamie Shaw, who's a legend in the cannabis industry. I first met Jamie, I guess, about 2 years ago now, and I see her at cannabis conferences. I see her speaking at cannabis conferences. I see her articles that she writes on cannabis, and she's been one of the Canadian cannabis leaders and advocates for decades. So welcome to License to Chill, Jamie.
Thanks for having me.
Jamie, I want to go back. How did it come to be that you got involved in this industry in the first place?
There was a couple of different sort of starts. I think that it's weird. It wasn't a smooth entry into the industry, I think, but there were things that happened earlier in my life that led to it. It's like, so I had done a lot of research on a documentary when I was making films about cannabis, and so I got super interested in the history of cannabis and history of cannabis prohibition. And then a few years later, a doctor diagnosed me with anxiety and suggested that I go to the Compassion Club. So then I became a member of the Compassion Club, and then a little while after that, I became a director of the Compassion Club. But it wasn't actually until Harper got elected for his last term that I said, okay, I'm actually going to go work for the Compassion Club, because he was saying he was going to shut them all down. And so I started actually working for the Compassion Club around that time, 2012, beginning of like January 2012. Yeah.
So for people who aren't familiar with what exactly is a Compassion Club?
That's tough, because there's never been like a real definition. But the BC Compassion Club Society started in 1997. It's North America's actually longest running dispensary, and it promoted a holistic approach to health. And so it had a lot of subsidized medicines. It had an apothecary next door, and it would use profits from the medical sales of cannabis to provide other herbs to members. A lot of ones in San Francisco were similar. The apothecary was kind of unique to the BC Compassion Club Society, but there were a lot of compassion clubs all through the Bay Area and Vancouver, a couple in Toronto, dating from the early 90s.
Now, are a lot of these compassion clubs now applying for a retail cannabis license?
Some are. Most are not. When I was at the Compassion Club, every time a new regulatory change would come in, we would look and see, is there a way that we can take care of our members under these rules? And the answer's always been no. I think they're applying this time, but it's still the same answer. Under the legal system the way it is now, most dispensaries cannot keep serving the patients that they're serving now. So that's why you're seeing, a lot of dispensaries closed, but some of the oldest in the country just got raided last week. They reopened. We're literally right back where we were in 2002, where we've got a handful of medical dispensaries that will continue serving their patients as long as they're able to, and a regulatory system that isn't paying attention.
Okay, now this conversation goes a whole bunch of different directions based on what you just said. Coming back on the raids, there have been quite a few of them. I understand that some places, when they've been raided, after they've been warned, they have chosen to reopen. And there's one, I think, open again. They were raided in the early afternoon, but he was back open at 4:20 in the afternoon. Interesting timing. And that there's a lineup around the corner and a lot of community support.
Same thing happened in Project Claudia. Lots has talked about how they shut down 60 dispensaries. Most of them were open an hour later. I had gotten off a plane when Project Claudia was being carried out, meeting an American friend, also from the American cannabis industry. And it took us maybe 10 minutes to get to a dispensary that had been raided earlier but was open and able to serve. So it's the same pattern that we've seen a lot, right? We've been seeing it over and over again in every jurisdiction. So it's kind of odd that we're still back there.
Yeah. Now, if you are applying for a retail cannabis license, and you are an illegal dispensary and you've been raided, my understanding is it's going to be pretty tough for them to get through the regulatory approval process.
Probably, probably. In BC, I think it's a little weird. The provincial government has been clear by what they've not been saying and how they've not been saying it, that they were giving traditional dispensaries a chance to get through the marketplace. There was no date that they were told to stop selling by, other than when you have a license, you can't sell illegal cannabis anymore. That's the guidelines they were given, right? So it's odd that would suddenly change without really any notice, other than community safety coming in a week before going, hey, okay, this has changed. So it's put some of them in a difficult position, but that's everything about the way this was handled did, right? Like, there were a bunch of dispensaries that shut down on legalization day because they were sure that if they were open past that day, and then they saw after a few months that no, actually it didn't affect it, and the closest the government had kind of ever come to saying was literally, the day you have a license, you can't sell illegal cannabis anymore. So, some people had a hard time because they closed. Some people had a hard time because they didn't close. Every situation is kind of so unique right now.
Yeah, there's no question that government's messaging on this thing was really flawed in the fall of a year ago, because some people were told, if you want a retail cannabis license and a chance at it, shut down now and wait. And some of these people are waiting for a year for their application to get through the system. Some people continued to operate, and they got through the system and now have a retail cannabis license. So it's been a real mixed bag. Now let's talk a little bit about the rollout of cannabis. We're 1 year after legalization. What's your take on how the 1 year's gone and where we're at in terms of the government process? I know you wrote a paper article for the business in Vancouver recently on red tape and cannabis. Can you give us your thoughts about how it's gone or not gone?
It's there's so many variables. It's a really nuanced conversation about why we're where we are, right? The BC government, in the very beginning, their messaging was absolutely flawed, but they were also hinting at things that you don't normally hear governments even hint at, such as keep selling illegal cannabis until the day you have a license. That was actually kind of astounding, right? But it didn't really get a lot of attention, on purpose. But there was also the whole idea that if they opened a whole bunch of stores right away, they were stores that were competing with all of these potential licensees that were trying to work their way through the system. They would be stores that were selling cannabis mostly not grown in BC, compared to stores selling local cannabis. It wouldn't have really made a lot of sense to open a whole bunch of stores in terms of BC's economy and what's already existing here, right? Cannabis is a large chunk of BC's economy, and it's not legal cannabis that makes up that big amount, right? And so it was kind of vital for the BC government to be able to transition that, and that's not really happened, because they hinted at Farmgate might come down the line once there's actually micros licensed. You could see them maybe saying, once there's some more BC micros licensed, then we can kind of open more stores, and we can kind of actually transition our economy. But you really kind of need to see that whole picture, and then with the licenses not coming, and then Health Canada suddenly changing it so that you had to do your whole build out before you could even apply. That really put BC in a what do you do? Like, they're trying their best to transition a system, at least they think they are, but they're actually being hamstrung at every level in trying to do that, right? So, right down to the medical dispensaries that we were talking about earlier, from the illegal recreational ones, the illegal medical ones, online sales, all of it, right? It's all still illegal for the most part, and there's not really a clear path for most of it to become legal.
No, I agree. Now, on the rollout, right now we've got applications in place for private stores. We've got the government has their stores, which are predominantly in the rural areas of the province. I understand the strategy is go the rural as opposed to urban areas first.
Which makes sense.
What are your thoughts about the selection of product made available by the Cannabis Distribution Branch in both government stores and private stores? What's your thoughts about the price points? With edibles coming on stream, what are your thoughts about how that's going to roll out, given our history of what we've just seen with respect to how they've rolled out the sale of cannabis to date? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think it'll keep building a market of people that are new to cannabis and don't really know any better. Unfortunately, the people that consume the most amount of cannabis are actually a small percentage of consumers that are extremely knowledgeable. And I think there was a stat recently where it was 90% of cannabis is consumed by 10% of Canadians. I mean, that's the market that you're not going to tap into with the rules the way they are right now.
In other words, they'll continue to stay with the black market.
Absolutely. And in addition to that, you're also forcing people to, right? If there's patients that need high dose edibles, for example, they have no other choice, right? There's nowhere they're going to be able to access it. They can make it themselves if they can grow it themselves, if they're in a state to be able to do that. A lot of the patients of, compassion clubs and dispensaries that we were talking about earlier can't afford to do that, even the ones that are able to, because that requires a steady space, that requires an uninterrupted life, that requires a steady cash flow of at least a certain amount. That's very difficult, right, for a lot of people. So there hasn't really been much of a move to cater to these people. And those are the two most important to me, right? From a social perspective, it's most important that the patients are taken care of. And from a business perspective, you would think it's most important that the market is taken care of. And if you're not taking care of the market, of course it'll take care of itself.
Yeah, they'll go someplace.
That's what happened.
Just like what happened during Prohibition with alcohol. People wanted it. It was illegal to buy it, so they made it themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, and they've got tons of evidence around things like this as well. In Ontario, I don't know how long ago now, maybe about 15 years ago, they lowered the price on cigarettes because they just could not stop the illegal flow of cigarettes, and they couldn't, stamp out that black market. And so it's kind of weird that they have to keep relearning lessons that they've learned in other industries that they're not realizing apply to cannabis as well.
Yeah. Now, I remember in Ontario there's a huge issue around people going onto First Nations property to buy tobacco products. And because
it was worse than that. So my hometown is in a weird place. It's right on the border of Ontario and Quebec and Canada and the United States. And there's a First Nation reserve, technically 3, that go right through all of those borders. And for a long time, they didn't have to actually go through customs. But even on the American side, so there was a time where cigarettes would be $9 in Ontario. And you could go on the reserve and you could get them for $1. Or you could cross into the States and you could get them for like $1.25. And the closer you got to New York City, the more expensive they got. And the closer you were to Canada, the cheaper they were. And so even taking the First Nations and reserves out of the equation, there was a lot of cross-border trade going on with cigarettes significantly cheaper along the northern U.S. border than anywhere else in the United States.
Now, coming back to cannabis in BC, as I understand it, for edibles, it's actually set by Health Canada, the maximum dosage for an edible is 10 milligrams, correct? Yeah. As I understand, if you're taking cannabis for medical reasons, that's equivalent to drinking light beer.
Yeah, I mean it's a serious issue. I mean, the Smith trial was around medical access to edibles, and what we're getting is adult use access, and that also kind of clouds the debate. I mean, 10 milligrams. For myself, that wouldn't do very much. I'd have to have a lot of it. But for a recreational experience, you don't know what it's going to do to somebody that hasn't really tried it before. They might find that very powerful. So I'm not that opposed to that in terms of a recreational market, at least as a starting point. But for a medical market, that's absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah. As I understand, you'd have to eat about 10 brownies to get the dosage you need.
Well, yeah, and that's it too, right? Like one of the really first casualties of regulation was in Vancouver when they wanted to license dispensaries. In order for Coastal Health to back them up, they had to remove edibles. Luckily, Vision Council at the time knew that they were very important, and so they made an exemption for edible oils and other types of simple extractions. And so that at least allowed compassion clubs to keep selling an edible product. But what they wiped out were products that had no sugar, products that were dairy-free, products that were gluten-free, some products that were all of those things. There was infused granola. There was infused dried fruit. There were things that were actually really good for patients that understood maybe people have different conditions and there's different things that they need to avoid, and the healthier it is, the better. And that was the very first casualty of any regulation in Canada, was when Vancouver came out with those regulations. And we saw those disappear. And everywhere else in BC, it was gummies, it was chocolate bars, it was lollipops. It wasn't at all healthy, right? And we're seeing that continue into legalization instead of a return to the really healthy products that had come up naturally in Vancouver.
So do you see moving forward that the government will carry more of those healthy products, or where is that? Is the government receptive to discussing this?
Well, I mean, they're treating it like it's just a recreational substance. The Liberals, when Joyce Murray first started kind of pushing the platform for legalization, for the Liberals to be behind that in 2013, they were meeting with a lot of activists, and we were telling them that legalizing cannabis doesn't fix everything we're talking about. We were all talking about medical cannabis. And so we're like, great, you want to legalize? Awesome, go ahead. But it doesn't solve the issue. And what we saw even as recently as the task force report, they were split on the idea of whether to even have a separate system for medical or not, because half of them were convinced it wasn't necessary, which is the problem. It's actually the root of the problem. They've put an extra tax on it. They refuse to call it a medicine. And it doesn't look like they have any interest in actually improving medical access. So, we're not really doing this right at all.
Yeah, that's my take. Now, what happened in the United States around this? When the states legalized, like California, for example, did they, my understanding, they did create a separate channel or separate policies for medical cannabis?
It depends. They were all very different, right? Like some of the very early ones were actually based on some models that we had set up here. New Jersey's very first model, New Hampshire's very first model was based on a Compassion Club type model. The ones in the Bay Area that were also the oldest, you see Berkeley has subsidized medicine for people of low income. Oakland has a really big inclusivity kind of different. They've made bylaws around minority businesses and who gets licenses, and they've had some amazing policies and success in Oakland. Not so much in other cities so far. San Francisco also, you saw some really progressive laws, but then you also see cities that were sort of against it, and so you see some bad laws there. In Washington, when they rolled it out, they did something pretty similar to what we're doing, where they had patients in Washington had the right to access medical access, but there was nowhere they could access it. So there were a whole bunch of gray market dispensaries that were specifically only dealing with, you had to be a resident of Washington and you had to have authorization to use cannabis. That's the only people they would serve to. Then when Washington legalized, they didn't include those medical dispensaries. Strangely, Washington's kind of come to an interesting place, at least in terms of recreational market, where what they have legally now looks like what we used to have illegally. It's pretty close. In terms of medical access, they're still dealing with black market dispensaries because there's nowhere else for them to go. Colorado and other states have said the medical dispensaries that are there now should be the first licensed. Colorado's had a pretty smooth rollout, especially when you start comparing it to all other states. The rollout was fairly seamless. There were certain issues early on, but it's actually been a fairly smooth system. People in Colorado seem happy with it, that there's the medical access is still there because that was the first thing regulated. So it really kind of depends, I think, who's in government at the time that the state is forced to do that, and what their goals actually are. The biggest thing, I think, the difference is that because the states are doing it themselves illegally, according to the federal government, their ulterior motive is to protect that state's industry. Well, that's actually pretty good, right? Like that actually aligns. Here we've got a federal government, and that's where you see the problems that I was talking about earlier with BC. You've got a BC government that's trying to figure out, okay, how do we make sure that BC doesn't really get killed by this when we just lose this giant part of our economy and don't transition it? And you've got the Canadian government that doesn't care at all about whether the local stores in BC or the local farmers in BC have jobs. So in many ways, the states are very lucky to be able to do it on a local level.
Yeah, and now of all the states in the United States, I'm going to put you on the spot here a little bit. Which state do you think got it right, or the best, closest to getting it right?
I can't. I have to make a Franken-state of like California, Washington. Something like that,
not
right?
Colorado.
And not Washington, D.C.,
Oh, yeah,
Washington, D.C.
Washington, forget that one. So what about Colorado? I've always...
So, like I was saying earlier, I think that the focusing on what was existing was huge for them. California did not do that, but now they're actually making some really, particularly the SAR. I was lucky enough to be able to interview her at ICBC recently, and I asked her, I was like, okay.
I enjoyed that interview.
Yeah, she was really great. And I asked her, you know, as a state, how can you force a city that's a lower level of government than you, that you can't really tell exactly what to do in that way, how do you force them to have more diversity initiatives to make sure that they're giving more licenses to the people of color communities that have been, you know, targeted more throughout this entire drug war? And she just kind of, like, she didn't miss a beat. She was just like, well, we can just not give them money for other stuff. and the fact that she was so willing to say that and so quickly, it showed that at least that group of bureaucrats, you know, regardless of what the elected politicians might tell you, that group of bureaucrats really cared. And that's, we're kind of there in BC too. Like, one of the things that's really, I've found sort of sad is that all of my time dealing with bureaucrats in British Columbia, particularly around health, they're really educated on cannabis. They're really smart, but they're not the ones that get to set the policy directions. They can only make certain recommendations when they get the policy directions from whoever's in charge. And so it's been really kind of sad to see certain people like Dr. Brian Emerson is a perfect example. We were at an arthritis conference recently where we were broken up into groups and told to kind of like write down what was really important to educate people on when legalization came. And this government bureaucrat, this doctor, wrote down spirituality. He thought the most important thing was that we not forget the spirituality part of the plant. You know, like I said, we've got very educated bureaucrats. They're not the ones that get to set the policy.
In other words, it goes from those people over to the law enforcement, the regulators, and who set all the policies in place to prevent people from having access to the product they want to have access to.
Yes, yeah, and on the direction of, right, whoever's sort of in charge. And all they can do is say, well, these are our best recommendations. This is what, you know, but you'll notice, like, a good example of it is when Vancouver did decide to start regulating dispensaries, and the provincial government didn't say a word. The provincial health officer came out and said, we think it's a good move. And there was no outcry from any bureaucrats anywhere in the province. There was none. Right. And that's another one of those things that kind of went under people's radar. They didn't really notice, but it's like, that was pretty telling in terms of who's doing the actual work. Again, if they're being directed to do it in a way that's not going to be helpful anyway, there's not much they can do.
Yeah. Now, you and I have attended a lot of conferences. You've been to a lot more than I have. Matter of fact, I still remember walking down the street in Toronto this summer at the LIFT conference there. Conferences out here. There's another big LIFT conference coming up here in January.
I go outside of a lot of conferences. I'm not necessarily inside.
Well, that's where the real conference takes place.
That's why you saw me on the street outside of, yeah.
But that's where the real conference takes place at these things. It's like going to a political convention. The real action's out in the hallways and the corridors and outside, not in the hall.
And at the bar, come on.
And at the bar, absolutely. But coming back on this, at these conferences, the first thing I noticed that most of them, there are very few officials there from the provincial government, if any. Yeah. The Health Canada people tend to show up, and they've been pretty good at speaking, reaching out, and listening. But the BC bureaucrats aren't there, and I'd love to see them there speaking, talking, or just being in listening mode and listening to what's going on. But the other thing is, I know that in terms of how we ended up with the model we have in BC, the mixed model where you have government stores and private stores, that initially the BC NDP government in the last election said that they were going to put retail cannabis into liquor stores, private liquor stores and government liquor stores. And indeed, then opposition leader Horrigan was on CKNW in a debate with Christy Clark and the leader of the Green Party. And he said, no, if we're elected, we're going to put them both in the same store. Christy Clark's position was, no, you can't put two vices in the same store. And as I understand what happened was Horrigan got into government. It was the health officials that came in and said, no, you can't put two vices in the same store. You got to separate them out. Even though we got situations where the cannabis store could be the thickness of a wall away from a liquor store.
Yeah.
So coming back on it, that's the last thing I ever heard that the health officials were really wading in on the whole cannabis thing. Is there an opportunity for them to now go to the Attorney General and the Solicitor General, who both have responsibilities in this area, and say, guys, you need to change this thing up a bit?
The problem is, at least from my last few conversations with like Mary Shaw, for example, the problem is that they are trying their best to support local. They want to, and it's other things that are getting in the way. It's ALC, it's municipalities, it's Metro Vancouver. It's things that are really not anything to do with them, and nothing that's in their power to fix. So that's another problem, right? That was sort of what I was talking about in the article that you mentioned earlier. There's layers of governments and organizations and commissions that all kind of want to have a say in how cannabis is regulated, how it's grown. And so that's, you're seeing a patchwork of some pretty harsh things in certain areas. Yeah.
And I had a meeting this week with the City of Vancouver senior official, and they said, well, we're still waiting to see what revenues flow to us, but nothing's been received yet from the province on cannabis. Yeah. And yet they're dealing with a lot of the enforcement stuff, costs of policing and everything else, plus processing applications. Whether it be a development permit or the licensing application. Now, in terms of your activism with government, you're a director of the BC Independent Cannabis Association. Mm-hmm. What exactly is that?
Well, so the BC Independent Cannabis Association mostly is about being independent in BC and cannabis.
Pretty well covered.
We put on educational events about once a month where we have industry professionals kind of come in and just talk and share knowledge. Sometimes there's different topics, so we'll have a panel. The events are always free, so the whole goal is to get people really educated about all of the regulatory changes that come all the time, all the nuances, hear from people that are dealing with the problems. So I was lucky enough to interview John Conroy for a little while ago last time. Travis Lane, I think, was the last one talking on some growing techniques. But it's just to kind of educate people in BC that are interested in the industry on what's going on, and just as a resource for them.
Now, you mentioned John Conroy. He's a legend in the legal community, fighting the fight on cannabis. Now, is he part of this current medical dispensary battle before the courts?
He is. This is I believe it's an offshoot of an earlier case. And so he was in that earlier case as an addition. So it was like a side issue. But yes. Yeah, the short answer, yes. Now, Jack Lloyd, who's also awesome.
Yeah. Are you following that? Are you following that case fairly closely?
Yeah, I am. I'm interested to see how it goes. I've talked about some of the earlier cases that led to this. I really feel that it was treated as a loss. I wasn't involved in the case at all, but there was a bunch of dispensaries trying to appeal to the city of Vancouver. But what they were really saying was that the city didn't have the right to license an illegal business. And so even though they kind of took it as a loss personally to themselves in the terms of that court case, what that court case actually affirmed was that a city has the right to license an illegal business. And so in my mind, that's where everything should have gone in terms of the fight for medical cannabis dispensaries, particularly in certain communities. I think that could have been an approach that was taken, but instead I think it went into appeal, and I don't know if people were kind of paying attention to the nuances of how that ruling came out. So in terms of the one that's been going on for the last 2 days, I'll wait until it's.
Yeah. Now that appeal came out as a result of a previous court decision, where the court ordered that the dispensaries in Vancouver had to shut down. The illegal dispensaries had to shut down for medical.
I'm not entirely sure whether this is the same one, because I know that I actually would have to double check that, because I know that there was the challenge that was launched first, and then there was also an appeal launched by a group of 36. So yeah, I think it was the ones that weren't licensed that started this one.
Okay, yeah, that's my understanding too. Yeah. Now, in terms of you and the work of the Independent Cannabis Association, what else is going on that you're involved with?
Well, Groundwork's still going, and Four Plants Cup has been really exciting to kind of watch that happen. That was just a bunch of Canadian cannabis people on Twitter going, "Hey, we should do this."
Can you put some flesh on those bones for our listeners?
Yeah, so the Four Plants Cup is Canada's first sort of legal home grow cup. We figured out a way that the judges are the contestants, so they're just sharing their cannabis amongst themselves. They've got four plants to grow and compete against each other in various categories, including like amateur and pro and indoor and outdoor and various things like that. Part of the process required judging on growing journals and things like that. So while it is a competition, it's really kind of meant to kind of show people that you can grow four plants and how you can grow four plants and different techniques and tricks that might work for you and that maybe worked for certain people in the competition. So it's we do have some great prizes, and it's going to be it's really exciting to kind of watch it come along.
Can the public go and watch this happening?
I don't know if we've decided on a live event anywhere because it's nationwide, and so it's kind of difficult to say. Okay, well. Where would we put it? So I don't think the decision has been entirely nixed yet, but
so it's not quite like an international wine competition where people bring in wines from around the world and they have professionals taste it, sample it, and if they rate them and they get medals.
It's like a modern version of that. Everything I think gets done through the post and through the internet. Right?
Okay,
So,
that sounds fascinating. So the Four Cups comes from the fact that people
four
can
plants.
Four plants. You can grow four plants legally.
Yeah.
Heaven forbid you have a fifth plant.
Yeah.
And you can't have it. You can't have it located at your property or a place where people can see it from outside or off property, which is interesting. And then you take that, you have the competition, and I guess people are trying to genetically alter the plants and move them and work with the strains and do different things with it.
Oh, well, I mean, that's not really what this one's about. So it's not about the genetics or the breeding of it necessarily. It's more just kind of about the growing technique. That's one of the reasons why they're being marked also on a journal. Like, did you keep a good growing journal where you kind of described everything that happened so you could track if there was a problem or you knew how to kind of what to tweak. And so it's not so much about the breeding or the genetic as it is about just growing.
All right. Well, coming along that line, I still find it fascinating that this one plant has so many benefits compared to dandelions or ragweed or something else that's out there. I just find it amazing that this one plant has so many properties and so many benefits.
Well, and it's not like entirely without precedent. I kind of make the joke a lot of times that people think it's going to be like this huge crop comparable to like alcohol or tobacco, and it's like I'm like no, it's like corn. You can make intoxicants out of it. You can make fuel out of it. You can corn isn't everything. Corn starch. Corn flour. It's like that's what cannabis could be like and should be like.
Yeah, you can make salads for cows out of corn. Then coming back to you were just recently with Pasha Brands.
Yeah.
And I heard a report that you might be doing something different.
I'm not entirely sure. I have received notice, and then there was a press release put out yesterday. So that's about all I can say on that for now.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
In terms of the structure of our industry, if you had any recommendations do you have any recommendations how we should be changing that industry up? Because the way I kind of see it is I think right now as we're sitting here talking, there's people driving around the province looking for sites for cannabis stores. And are we going to get to and there's no limit on the number of cannabis stores. It's not like liquor stores where there's a limit there's a moratorium on the issuance of new ones. Are we going to get to a saturation point or an oversaturation point and there'll be too many cannabis stores and some stores will close? And are we going to have the same thing in the cultivation side of things because there's a lot of interest in becoming a producer or a processor? What are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. It can change, right? Like the micro license program wasn't horrible. It was a pretty good amendment to the previous program, and it was going to bring in a lot of people. Then by changing that halfway through and requiring a grow, that blocked a lot of people. And so it depends on further changes whether they're going to keep shutting people out or not. Absolutely, there's a saturation point, particularly, again, when you're talking about a different stream of product completely. I've been watching arguments on social media the last couple of days about, well, there's too much cannabis in the space, and oh no, there's a shortage of cannabis in the space, and you see people stating both sides very vehemently, and it's this one brush across Canada doesn't work to understand what's going on. So in Newfoundland, we've had private retailers close because there's no product for them. In Alberta, the retailers were worried that they were handing out so many licenses that they weren't going to be able to survive the startup costs of being a business because there was too much other competition. Then you see Ontario that's clamoring for more stores. Even though they've actually got more than they were supposed to at this point under WIN, right, which kind of keeps getting left out of most conversations around their rollout. Saskatchewan seems to be doing just fine. Retailers there are in a tougher spot because they don't have the same sort of buying power that a province does. So that's kind of a sore spot in Saskatchewan. I think, I saw an interesting thing in Thailand the other day where they're going to allow patients to grow 6 plants. So they get
really?
2 more. They get 2 more than us.
2 more.
But also they're going to be allowed to sell it to the government for medical cannabis. I think some sort of a program like that where you're actually testing cannabis, particularly if it's being donated by people, make sure that there's some quality control on it. There's no reason that can't be a valid source of subsidized medicine. There's no reason we can't have collectives. There's no reason we can't have any of those things other than the way the regulations are written right now. So,
yeah, I would, in terms of our province, I'd love to see us get to the point where you have farm gate sales.
Yep.
I think that would be huge because it solves a lot of problems. Secondly, I'd like to see the point where a producer can have a retail store at the production site just selling their own product, just like you go to a winery or a brewery and you can go and buy the product from them. I'd also like to see us get to the point where we have my own view is the government should not be in the retailing of cannabis business. They should be out of it because it creates an awkward relationship that we see on the liquor side as well, where your business partner is the liquor distribution branch or the cannabis distribution branch, but they are also still your competitor.
And it's also sort of indicative of the lack of respect that they have for the market that forced them to admit they were wrong this whole time, because all these provinces just suddenly thought they could do brokers' jobs. That was a very specialized skill. There was a very small subset of people that were very good at that. That's a whole other job and a whole other skill set that a province doesn't have at all. And to think that, for them to think that they would is hubris.
Now, I want to come back to the BC Independent Cannabis Association.
Yeah.
Would you ever consider organizing a roundtable discussion that would involve the regulators from the province, Health Canada officials, and our BC health officials to talk about all these issues we've been talking about and try and get them to the table to say, okay, we're 1 year in, here's what we see going wrong, this is what we think you've done right, these are the changes we'd like to see moving forward. Because that, to me, is a dialogue that needs to happen.
Yeah, that is, we've got different levels of government and different agencies all telling each other sort of different things and going about different goals, right? And so I think an inclusive discussion with all of those groups would be good. I also would include First Nations groups on that because their issues have really not been looked at all. Everything to do with the Cannabis Act does not comply with the First Nations Land Management Act or the Indian Act or UNDRIP, right? So there's some serious issues there that need to be worked out as well. So,
yeah, I agree with that. And on the First Nations one, there's always this underlying feeling out there in the cannabis industry that the First Nations applications are getting through the system faster. And secondly, I just was brought to my attention a few weeks ago that there's a drive-through cannabis store on a First Nations property up near Enderby.
Yeah, which is probably one of the reasons why they started putting licenses through faster. There was a pretty well-publicized story of a First Nations reserve not getting their license. So then they started, pushing them through, especially because most are not interested in applying for different reasons, right? But many of them are still interested in cannabis. So it creates an interesting situation.
Now, were you speaking at the ICBC conference? The LIFT conference. Okay, get all these conferences straight.
I am speaking at the ICBC in San Francisco. Yeah.
When's that?
That one is February, I think. Yeah.
And then what, in January at LIFT?
No, I'll be outside somewhere maybe, but that's
No
where I
more
was the
panels.
last 2 lifts. Yeah.
Well, I thought you did a great job interviewing the woman from the California
Lori
Cannabis
Ajax,
Bureau.
thank
Yeah,
you.
Lori Ajax. She was terrific.
Yeah, she really was.
And,
And it was nice to see a government regulator, especially at that level, that really did seem to understand the issues and really did care about it, at least from a local business perspective. And that's, like I said, that's their benefit of being able to do it at a state level, where we're hampered by doing it federally.
Yeah. Well, listen, thank you very much for coming on to License to Chill.
Thanks for having
Please
me.
come back, because I'm sure there's going to be another
finish the
installment.
joint.
Oh, yeah. There's one thing you can do here, because we're not on TV. But anyway, do come back and keep us informed of what's going on with Jamie Shaw. Thank you very
I will
much
do
for
my
being
best.
here. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
You've been listening to License to Chill with your host, Bert Hick. This podcast is recorded live at Studio 710 in downtown Vancouver and produced by Jade Maple. For more information, check out risingtideconsultants.ca.